Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a really provocative academic article. It asks a tough question, what happens when a sacred identity, one that's born from humility, gets kind of repurposed as a tool of pride in our modern debates? Let's dive right in.
This one line, right from the article's abstract, it gets right to the heart of the whole argument. The author, Yakub Kripanik, is basically suggesting that the Jewish covenant, the sign of divine election, can be, in his words, hijacked and turned into an instrument of pride. Now that's a bold claim for sure. So throughout this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what he means by that and how he builds his case.
All right, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with this whole idea of a covenant in captivity. Then we'll look at what the author says was its original purpose. From there, we'll explore two diverging modern paths he talks about, unpack his claim of a new kind of privilege, see how pride fits into all this, and finally, wrap up with his conclusion and proposed response.
Okay, so let's start with this central thesis. The author is essentially arguing that you can have the symbols of an identity, kind of like its cultural shell, even long after the original religious meaning has been stripped away. So he's asking a pretty big question. What happens when the signs of the Jewish covenant are used to push for goals that, in his view, are the complete opposite of its original purpose?
But to really get this idea of a hijacked covenant, we have to rewind a bit. We need to go back to the source. So, what was the covenant's original purpose, at least according to the author? To see what he calls a distortion, we first have to understand what he believes the original was. Now, the author's entire argument really hinges on this specific definition. He's claiming the covenant was never meant to be some kind of badge of superiority or national prestige. Not at all. Instead, he defines it as a structure of humility, a relationship that was all about orienting the people toward God, demanding service and dependence, not, self-glorification. And to support this point, the author points to Scripture, like this verse you see here from Leviticus. He argues that this idea of being separated or holy, it wasn't about being better than other people. It was about being set aside for God. It was a mission of service, not a claim of superiority.
Okay, so that's the author's definition of the original intent. Now he fast forwards to our time, to the modern era. And here he sees that original meaning splitting really into two completely different paths.
So here's the split that the author lays out. On one path, you've got what he calls the faithful witness. These are Jews who continue to live the covenant through faith and humility. But then there's this other path, a secular Jewish identity. He says this is one that holds on to the cultural signs and the history, but in his analysis, it's become detached from its religious roots.
And to make this more concrete, the author gives some specific examples. For that faithful witness path, he points to traditional religious practices, things like observing Shabbat. Now, for the secular identity path, he points to influential secular Jewish figures, citing the philosopher Judith Butler as an example. He argues that their advocacy for certain ideas, like gender theory, is an instance of using the cultural weight of a Jewish identity for purposes he sees as detached from its religious source.
All right, now we're getting to one of the article's most, let's call it provocative claims. The author argues that this secular Jewish identity actually benefits from what he calls an informal affirmative action in public debates. So, what does he mean by that? Let's unpack it.
So, to explain this idea, the author brings in a concept from sociology called symbolic capital. Think of it like this. It's basically a kind of prestige or moral authority that acts like a non-financial currency. It's credibility that you can spend, so to speak, to gain influence in big public debates.
The author then breaks down how he believes this symbolic capital gets applied in a three-step process. Okay, so step one, there's the widespread, undeniable recognition of the Jewish people's historical suffering. Step two, in his view, this confers a kind of unique moral prestige. And then the final step in his argument, step three, he claims this prestige is sometimes used to shield certain secular ideas from critique. How? By framing any critique of the ideas as an attack on Jewish people themselves.
So how does this all connect back to the title of the article, Covenant and the Captivity of Pride? Well, the author links this whole use of symbolic capital directly to the theological concept of pride.
He argues that pride, which he defines as placing the self and its own desires above everything else, is the real engine driving what he sees as major shifts in modern morality.
And he uses a very classic definition of pride, pulling from the theologian Thomas Aquinas. So from this specific perspective, pride isn't just, being arrogant or boastful. It's something more fundamental. It's the act of putting your own will and your own desires above any outside authority or even reality itself. It's about reordering the entire world around the self.
Okay, so the author then points to what he specifically calls modern moral inversions, which he believes are driven by this very pride. He lists several examples here, and he argues that each one elevates an individual's will over what he sees as a pre-existing moral or natural order. And this, he claims, is the real heart of his argument. These shifts gain traction and influence precisely when they're pushed by voices who are protected by that symbolic capital we were just talking about.
So, after laying out this really complex and frankly critical argument, where does that leave us? What does the author propose as a way forward? Well, he wraps up his article by outlining what he believes is the necessary Catholic response to this whole situation.
The author's proposed solution is something he calls a dual recognition. It's a two-part approach. On one side, he says, there needs to be clarity. The clarity to identify and, yes, critique the misuse of covenantal prestige when it's used to promote ideologies contrary to the Catholic faith. But on the other side, there has to be charity. The charity to honor and respect the faithful witness of God-fearing Jews.
Ultimately, he frames his conclusion as a call to balance these two virtues. He argues for a path that avoids two extremes. On one end, staying silent just for fear of causing offense, and on the other, engaging with contempt. For him, it's really all about holding a clear-eyed analysis while at the same time maintaining a spirit of genuine respect.
And that really leaves us with a final, much broader question to think about, one that goes way beyond this one article. In our really complex world, how do we figure out when a group's unique history gives it a special kind of authority in public debate? And maybe more importantly, what are the boundaries of that authority? That's a huge question and something for all of us to consider. Thanks for tuning in.